Hey, I wanted to explain how different gauges of looms and different weights of yarn used with corresponding gauges they're supposed to be used with can change one pattern, switching from gauge to gauge and different weights of yarn. Sometimes you might see a pattern done with a certain weight of yarn, and you might say, well, I'm going to do this in a different weight of yarn, and it doesn't look the same. And that's because of the center to center differences in pegs is how they're measured. This is a quarter gauge, and I'm going to be showing you the difference between a quarter, a 3/8 gauge, and a 5/8 gauge, how using different yarns that are supposed to be used with these looms, according to the gauge and the weight of yarn, and using the same pattern changes from gauge to gauge and weight of yarn to weight of yarn. So we're going to start out with a quarter gauge, and this is a Sandywood loom, sock loom, quarter gauge. And if you just watch my other video on the rice stitch or ribbed rice stitch, I used a number 2 sport weight on this quarter gauge, which is what you're supposed to use on a quarter gauge. Baseline is a number 2 or number 1. You can use a lightweight number 3 and it'll have a tighter stitch. I don't think I've ever used a 3 on my quarter gauge yet, but I have used number 2 and number 1 on it. So this is my rice stitch on this loom. So that's what a quarter gauge of my rice stitch looks like. I put a focus here for a minute. There we go. Now if you watch my other video, you probably noticed that it looked a lot different than this. And it does, I cast it on starting the stitch. I didn't like do a chain cast on or anything. I just started the stitch like I did in the video, so everything will be kind of uniform across the board. And it's got this little scalloped edge on it. But this is a number 2 sport weight yarn on a quarter gauge. And you can see that the ribbing is very noticeable, but it kind of loses some of the stitch definition in the middle. It's there, but it's, if you can see it, but it's not as defined as what I'm getting ready to show you with the number 4 worsted. This is a number 4 worsted. We're going to move gauges now. This is a number 4 worsted on the 3/8 gauge. This is I Love Looming 3/8 gauge round loom. And this, you can see there's much more stitch definition between the ribbing. You can see the ribbing lines here. And the stitch definition is much more noticeable. This worsted yarn is, it just has a better stitch definition a lot of times. And this is one strand. Both of the number 2 and the number 4 is one strand. This is not 2 strands. This is one strand. It's very thick. Can't see through it on this 3/8 gauge. But I did this stitch, this rice or ribbon rice stitch, I did it on this gauge because I wanted to see what kind of stitch definition I had, and it really has a lot. And I used it on as an example that you could use it for brim and hat. It does not roll. Doesn't roll at all. Works very well. So that's a number 4. Then I used a number 3 on this 3/8 gauge, same loom. And you can tell that the definition isn't quite as much either. It's a little bit different. You can see it, but it's just a little bit different. And it's different than this number 2 also. But this was done on 3/8, this was done on quarter. And you can tell the distance between the ribbing is wider here and not as wide here. And that's why the definition, you can't see the definition of that as much between the ribbon and you can this one, because the distance between the ribbon and the pegs and the yarn. It's amazing how it changes, isn't it? And then we have the 5/8 gauge. The 5/8 gauge, yes, this is a boy loom. I still do my 5/8 work on my boy looms. I have a round set and I have this little short long boy loom. I did a 5/8 gauge sample with a number 5 bulky yarn in the same rice stitch. And this is really interesting, the difference. A lot of difference in there. It's more lacy looking, more airy looking. The definition of the stitch is different. It just looks totally different. Now, I did notice something doing this pattern, this rice pattern. If you wrap to the left, it's going to look like this. Let's see if I can show you the difference. If you wrap to the left, no, this is the one wrapping to the left. Sorry about that. This is the one wrapping to the left, going that way. You cast on right and wrap to the left. The little bars here are going diagonal down this way, and the bulk of the stitch right here, the spine part or the rib part, the thickness is over here on this side. Okay? Now, if you cast on the left side going right, it's exactly the opposite. The bulk of the spine part is on this side, and the stitches are going this way. The looser stitches are going this way. So let me see if I can put them side by side. So I got it turned right. Okay. So this is right wrapping left, and this is left wrapping right. So you can see a difference. That's the only difference. It'll change depending on which way you wrap as to how this looks diagonal here, and it'll be the same. It'll change on the smaller stitches too, like the quarter gauge and the 3/8 gauge. So it'll depend on which way you wrap it. Like this right here, wrapping it one way, this will be on this side of the spine. If you wrap it the other way, it'll be on this side of the spine. These little areas right here will just be reversed. It still looks great, doesn't matter. It's just because you're wrapping it two different ways, and because I purled that second peg in the second row. If you've watched my video, if you hadn't, go back and watch my rice pattern video and you'll know what I'm talking about. But this is the differences in using different gauges of looms and different weights of yarn corresponding to what's supposed to be used with each gauge of loom, and using the same pattern. It's amazing the differences, how the spacing between the pegs, the center to center measurements between the pegs, because this is, from center to peg to center to peg, that's 5/8 right there, and that's that spacing that you see right here. That's your peg stitch, and that's the spacing of the stitch between those pegs. And I did do a smaller sample on the 3/8 gauge, and I did kind of pull it apart a little bit, and you could block that and have it lacier, like for a shawl or something, and it's got a scalloped edge on it. If you kind of pull it apart and spread it out, if you blocked it, I think it would stay that way. Or you could leave it tighter like this one is. But yep, that's pretty much the differences you see, and different weights of yarn and gauges of looms. So I hope that clarified it for you a little bit. Using the same stitch and how it changes using a 5/8, a 3/8, and a quarter gauge using my rice stitch pattern. So that's all I have for you today. I will be creating more videos later, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you much. Bye-bye.